Welcome to Hibbert Health. Today I have Professor Trevor Marshall joining me. Thank you so much for being here today, Professor.
It's great to be here, Jennifer.
Thank you. Professor Marshall is a research academic with degrees in engineering and a PhD in diabetes related to his research done at Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto, Canada. He developed the Marshall Protocol, a program for healing chronic inflammatory disease. He is a director of the Autoimmune Research Foundation, a fellow of the European Association for Predictive, Preventive, and Personalized Medicine in Brussels. He is a member of the International Expert Council, Community Practice Preventive Medicine in Moscow, and a past professor at several universities in New Guinea and Western Australia, and a past chair of the Engineering in Medicine and Biology IEEE Society in Ventura. Professor Marshall has published hundreds of papers and has lectured and taught at international and national conferences and continues to be in great demand for his knowledge base and skills across the world. Pasteur once said, "In science, chance favors the prepared mind." This is true for Professor Marshall in the fields of both medical science and engineering. Professor Marshall, as I pointed out, you've published several papers, and I see you've been publishing peer-reviewed papers about autoimmune and chronic disease for several decades. Please tell us what your interest now is in COVID-19.
Well, the papers that I've been publishing since the turn of the millennium basically result from some breakthroughs I made back then into techniques for analysis of the way that proteins and metabolites interact inside the human body. I was an early adopter of a field called molecular dynamics, where you don't deal with molecules as being static, but they're actually 3D models that move around in real time. And you can see how they interact, and you can change the environment in which they're interacting, and you can do quite a lot of simulation of interaction between drugs and receptors, for example. This brought me to an understanding of a number of things which are not very well understood by medicine even today. And we made a couple of breakthroughs back then. You mentioned one, the Marshall Protocol, identifying a drug which was a great help to people suffering from autoimmune and idiopathic diseases. Idiopathic means without any obvious cause, like ME/CFS is one of those diseases, fibromyalgia. There are a number of them. And I could see at the time that people were suffering very badly from the disease symptoms, and yet there was no therapy for it, and it was difficult even to get physicians to recognize and give a diagnosis. Back around 2005, I started to work the conference circuit, going to the large international medical conferences and talking about how molecules actually behave in the human body, how they interact. And the particular model of how the human body becomes ill that I developed in my mind was what I've primarily been promoting for the last 20 years. And that is, I believe that all chronic disease, long-term disease, is a result of of an imbalance in the microbes which live within our body. We have microbes that live in our brains, in all the tissues of our body, and obviously the gut microbiome has been pretty well defined, but also the brain microbiome has become more and more investigated over the last decade. And at the moment, one of my colleagues is spending quite a lot of time looking at dementia and Alzheimer's and how that seems to be driven by viruses, which are persistent within the brain tissue. So that's my background. So I was interested in COVID because COVID was not supposed to exist. If you follow the pragma of modern medicine, a virus comes along and the body recognizes the virus, produces some antibodies, and very quickly the virus has been killed off and it's all gone. That's it. The concept of a persistent virus is not one that medicine has adopted well, in exactly the same way as they have failed to adopt the knowledge necessary to understand and fight persistent bacteria like Mycobacterium tuberculosis, for example. TB is endemic in the population these days. It's a persistent virus. It has to be continuously treated to keep it low. Otherwise, it will gradually build up over time. And COVID, I saw COVID as being a very similar pattern of life, but as a virus, not as a bacterium. And so when I started to see articles like this one, some COVID-19 patients struggle with forms of psychosis, puzzling for the psychiatrists because they can't understand why this could possibly be. And yet I'd been working with people that have been suffering from neurological issues for decades. So I could see that what we were dealing with here was probably a persistent pathogen which needed treatment, and that leaving it untreated is just asking for trouble in the long run. That sooner or later it'll come along and become prevalent enough to start causing real sickness. And that is indeed what's happening. The neurological changes, particularly depression, are starting to become recognized now and led to this phrase, long haulers, to somehow imply that people that suffer in this way are fundamentally different from the rest of us. Long COVID is another name that has been coined to try and describe the cause of the disease, of the viral pathogen. To us, we just see it as yet another pathogen that can produce disease. There was talk about 10 years ago of chronic fatigue syndrome being caused by a virus called XMRV. And I had many talks with the scientists that discovered that, trying to understand how a simple organism could cause such a complex disease, such a huge cascade of symptoms, besides which at that point we didn't have any treatments. So we couldn't address those pathogens. One way of observing that a pathogen is the cause is to get rid of that cause and see the disease disappear over time. In fact, that's the best way to develop an understanding of a disease. We didn't have the treatments available, but with COVID, we were very lucky because there was a research group down in Melbourne, Australia, that back in April found that COVID was killed by a very common drug called Ivamectin. In fact, its most common use in the United States is to treat in humans the hair lice that kids get at school. We give it without question to our kids, and we give it to tens of millions of people in other parts of the world where parasites are a problem, because it's primarily been used in the past as an antiparasitic, and it's been given by the tens of millions, literally, to people in those countries without any serious side effects, without any life-threatening side effects.
Absolutely. And the WHO endorsed distribution. With Merck, when they had the patent, they did widespread distribution and millions and millions and millions of doses, correct? And they even had lay people distributing it because they felt it was such a safe drug.
That's correct. And they even suggested that all humans should take the drug because there were no obvious harmful effects. And it's sometimes very difficult to pick up the effects of parasites when you're in a developed country. Or until the parasitic disease becomes quite bad.
Can you talk a bit about ivermectin and just the effect that it does have? Because I think this may be an area of concern with people, and when they talk about side effects of ivermectin, it may actually not be the ivermectin they're having side effects from, but the parasites. Is that correct?
If you look at our papers on recovery from chronic disease, you'll find that the biggest thing that we've had to deal with is a phenomenon where, as you are treating, symptoms will change, and sometimes the diagnosis will change as well. Now, when people are recovering from HIV, this is pretty well documented. There's a phenomenon called IRIS, Immune Reconstruction Inflammatory Syndrome, which basically says that it's a syndrome you get when your immune system is reconstructing itself again after having been damaged or at least put off balance by the HIV. In the case of bacteria, it was discovered very early. In the case of viruses, it's well documented with HIV, which incidentally, I'd point out, is another persistent virus of a very similar family to the coronaviruses. When I was looking for info on this coronavirus, supposedly new, earlier this year, I found this chapter in a book called Comprehensive Virology, talking about coronaviruses. It talks about persistent infections. And it says the persistent infections established by some coronaviruses in their natural hosts should provide very good experimental models for elucidating the pathogenic mechanisms of some important human diseases. That is exactly what I'm interested in, because as I said earlier, the best way to learn about a disease is to watch people recovering from that disease. What I want to point out about this book chapter.
Yes.
There it is.
There we are. Yes.
It was published in 1979. 1979. So anybody that says that this is a new virus, it is a new form of the virus, however, that has been engineered to be particularly infectious. We know so little about viruses and all pathogens, in fact. This article from 1979 says at least 1/3 of human colds are caused by the coronavirus families that they had identified at that point in time. So yes, it is associated with common cold.
Interesting. Now, I've had a number of people question and concern when they hear, as you even mentioned too, the similarity of this coronavirus to the HIV. So they ask questions such as, should I be concerned when I've had the coronavirus? What are the similarities and how does it affect someone that has coronavirus or is recovering from coronavirus?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's early days. We only have 1 or 2 studies at this point of ivermectin and HIV, but the in vitro indications are that ivermectin is active against HIV. So it's a very wide spectrum antiviral.
Now, what about talk about the actual genome of the virus? Are you in agreement that part of the genome seems to be very similar to malaria or HIV?
Well, my colleague Luc Montagnier, who of course was the Nobel laureate whose lab discovered HIV, he put out an interview, it's in French, back in about February, and he described, from the point of view of an HIV expert, what he saw in the coronavirus genome decode that was similar to HIV and which was unusual to be present in a coronavirus. This is the first coronavirus, in fact, that is known to have those particular sequences. And he said that that is characteristic of a virus which has been bred to have those sequences mutated into its genome. And that's exactly what I have thought. The problem is that every coronavirus outbreak is a little bit different. There are decodes of RNA from Australia and from China. And I think there's one from Europe as well, certainly one from Russia, which are all a little bit different. They're not the same. We're not talking about one entity here. And that is very, very typical of a virus, because viruses mutate very quickly under environmental stress. And that includes stress like psychological stress in the individual as well. The virus mutates very, very quickly. And that's a characteristic of a virus.
Going back, because I'm still interested in this, the HIV and how the similarities, it looks engineered, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. This is the longest genome that's ever been identified for a coronavirus, which sets it up to have far more sites for mutations, which, as you say, it happens, as we all know too. I mean, they could never get a flu vaccine that would be totally effective because they're dealing with last year's flu, which is a different virus, and it's constantly mutating.
Did I tell you Ivamectin is effective against the influenzas? Even against Spanish flu, apparently.
It's against the common cold, everything, right? This is like this wonder drug. It's unbelievable.
Well, the thing is, the mechanism that it uses is common to all of the RNA viruses. And for anything that is an RNA-based virus is susceptible. And certainly the influenza viruses and even the Spanish flu virus was used in a lab at one stage, and it very quickly knocked that down as well.
Wow, that's amazing. There's a lot of studies now going on with cancer, and it's just endless.
Yeah, it's a new tool. It's a new research tool that is totally new. For example, the cohort that I'd put together for our work with the autoimmune diseases consists of health professionals as well as sophisticated end users. And most of them are taking ivermectin, have been for 6 months plus. What we're seeing is an iris, just like in the case of HIV people recovering, as the various viruses, the virus outbreaks in bodies are identified, and they're different for every person because we've all been subject to different environments and we've all picked up different viruses as we've gone through life. And those of us that have gone through more life are particularly susceptible in the case of coronavirus, because what coronavirus does is it potentiates the other viral infections as well. Once this newly engineered way of allowing the viruses to enter the cell starts to mutate into the other viruses that are within your body. You
mentioned that your cohort has been taking the ivermectin for 6 months.
We find that although most of the serious symptoms have gone by 6 months or so, that people who are chronically ill are still clearing the viruses from their body at that point. They're still getting iris induced by the antiviral.
Can you give us a few examples of what your cohort
is
experiencing?
One of my colleagues, who is a health professional, called me about 2 months ago and said that she couldn't move her fingers, that her fingers had gone arthritic, and she just wasn't able to move her fingers anymore and couldn't use the keyboard very easily, and everything else was a bit of a struggle too. Her family, she said, did suffer from rheumatoid arthritis, but it wasn't something that had been bothering her or manifesting with her until she had been on the ivermectin for about 3 months, 2 or 3 months. Then suddenly the hands froze. The pretty well back to normal now after 2 months. One hopes that they've gone for good now. The problem has gone for good, but these things can be quite debilitating. Somebody else had one of their legs suddenly break into blisters, weeping blisters, which is also pretty scary. But is apparently a different form of virus we weren't aware of that was being knocked down.
That's fascinating. Now, what is the dose of ivermectin that everybody was taking and continue to take?
The same as the CDC recommends, 0.2 of a milligram for every kilogram of body weight.
And taken how frequently?
Well, different people are taking it at different rates because it's cleared from the body very slowly. And if you've got a liver which isn't 100% healthy, it will clear it more slowly and it'll stay in the body for longer. So you don't have to take it so frequently. Most people are taking it at 1 week intervals. Some people are taking it at 3-day intervals, which is about the half-life that you would expect in a healthy body. It's about 100 hours half-life in the tissues of a healthy body, which is 3 days roughly.
An interesting aspect of all of this coronavirus and the infections people are happy to recover from. And then we see long haul symptoms and long COVID, long haul syndrome. Can you please talk a little bit about this? And it definitely relates a lot to your work that you've been doing for decades with autoimmune and chronic diseases, because it seems to bring out very unusual disease states that these people have never thought that they had. Can you please talk about this?
Right. And indeed, that is the correct description. As we grow older, we become hosts for a whole range of persistent pathogens, bacterial, viral, phage. Phage is a virus that attacks bacteria. A number of pathogens are pretty well documented, but most of them have not been because medicine has not really wanted to look at the possibility of infection causing chronic illness. The studies that we have done and the papers we've published have not been generally all that well received. Not that people have been critical of it, but more that I'd rather not think about it, thank you. The concept that some people might be becoming more ill induced by a coronavirus episode than others is not one that medicine really knows how to handle. They talk about comorbidities. It's not just that people have got something wrong with their cardiovascular system and that is made worse by the virus. There's actually an interaction between what we have documented. Plaque in the arteries, for example, is full of pathogens. Something like 27 known species that had been cultured out of plaque last time I looked, and that was 5 or 10 years ago. The way in which the microbes in our body are seen by medicine is very crude. And this is possibly because we haven't had the effective methods of treatment. I mean, it's really marvelous for me as a research tool to have ivermectin because it is so much better than the other antivirals that we've had in the past. For example, Morgellons disease, which is things coming out of skin, a very, very nasty disease.
Is this parasitic or
well, it's thought to be parasitic here.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like parasites when you look at it, but whether it is parasites or not, nobody really knows yet. But Morgellons has been thought to be a viral disease for some time, and it's been treated with a drug called Alinea, was the first antiviral they used. But Alinea recently was put up in price so that a single pill now costs about $800. I don't think they want us to be using antivirals somehow. And so those patients, many of them had been put onto ivermectin 5-10 years ago.
I guess that question mark of it being a parasite, they decided to try the ivermectin because nobody realized the antiviral nature of ivermectin until it started showing its effects with coronavirus. Is that correct?
Nobody had documented it until the group in Melbourne suddenly hit upon the mechanism. And once you understand the mechanism of action, you suddenly understand how it can be so effective against so many species and just about all of the mRNA viruses. From that point on, it was just a matter of figuring out a dosage. And from my colleagues, that was very simple. It's already approved at a certain dosage as being fully safe. So let's try that one first. And that one worked very well, which is the CDC dosage for scabies. You can look it up on their website. If the population as a whole starts to use ivermectin more than in a single or one or two doses in order to get rid of the COVID, if they're treating the long hauler symptoms, for example, with more frequent ivermectin, it's a medication which is an antiviral, and it's going to have many effects in the body if that body has been collecting persistent pathogens over the years. If you've been to Papua New Guinea, like me, for example, and actually we were taking hydroxychloroquine as an anti-malarial for that whole year. So that probably helped me out through that year.
You're protected. We know that. Now, a question for you regarding long haulers. Is it possible when we're talking about autoimmune and chronic diseases that the COVID-19 after recovering has actually triggered this in someone's body? Has it flipped a switch so that genetically they're now expressing this disease, or is it something else?
No, genetics are far too simple to try and describe what is happening. If you look at the genome, the number of proteins in the human body, which is about 1 million proteins, and yet the genome is only capable of producing 25,000 proteins. The rest all come from various effects we call epigenetics. But this is further than epigenetics. This is multiple microbes in the microbiome also interacting together and interacting with the epigenetic environment they find themselves in to create an almost imponderable cascade of cause and effect that ultimately result in the human body having difficulty adapting to the changes, therefore something which is diagnosed as illness.
Wow, this is like a universe inside of a universe inside of a universe. Now, continuing ivermectin, this apparently wonder drug, I'm hearing people say that their long haul symptoms start to resolve. So can this start reversing this cascade if they can eliminate completely or to enough degree the virus in their body?
Well, it's a persistent microbe. It's a persistent infection. Some people's bodies will be able to clear the infection. The action is one of precipitating activity of other persistent viruses in the body. It knocks down the body's ability to suppress other persistent infections that the body has, and they then start to become a problem, causing, in the case of that, the finger paralysis or the blisters in the legs. In the case of a long hauler, most of us are not going to be able to fully clear the coronavirus too. It's going to hang around, but it may not cause any problems beyond the occasional migraine or the occasional depression or some other symptom which is not associated with the coronavirus infection by a diagnostician. Most people really should assume that it's going to be persistent and they'll need more than one dosage of antiviral to help the body clear. The virus, it does seem to sensitize them to electromagnetic radiation as well. People are tending to be a lot more sensitive to Wi-Fi's in the home and have to switch off the Wi-Fi's. It's another long hauler symptom which is not yet fully appreciated.
Everything that you're talking about, it's fascinating. Of course, we're trying to understand the existence of a long hauler syndrome, long COVID.
Yeah, luckily the drug is very inexpensive. If you look back through my tweets, you'll find that I retweeted a couple of months ago a veterinary surgeon who said that he takes it every 10 days to protect himself from catching things from the animals that he has to deal with. And he's done that for many years. And I retweeted that tweet in my feed. And you'll also find other tweets that I'd retweeted where physicians say, look, the simplest and cheapest way for them to get hold of it is to use a veterinary version. And so a base of knowledge has built up that it is available. It's sufficiently in wide enough use that the FDA felt that they had to put out a warning. But they do try and appeal to your sense of not trying to deny this drug to the animals that need it. It's well worthwhile reading that FDA warning in detail. But I also found it interesting that they felt they needed to put it out there. Which indicates that there's probably a lot more going on in the background that none of us ever hear about because it never gets to the level of being mentioned to doctors. I sent out a tweet that the World Health Organization has now commenced a reevaluation of ivermectin for COVID. And the academic that they commissioned to do this study has produced a video with all of his raw results of the studies that are out there, which shows that this is real, and it's highly likely that WHO will be changing their advice on ivermectin very, very soon.
Now, we were back talking with the long haulers.
So long haulers is not very well defined because we don't have a good understanding of this being part of a general disease process, a general chronic long-lasting disease process, which it's now pretty apparent that it is, because the people that I've been working with have had a variety of diagnoses from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, all through the autoimmune conditions, and then chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia as well. And they very rarely have just one of these conditions. There are usually plenty of comorbidities in the chronically ill. So yes, we've had people with a whole range of diagnoses, and in general, yes, it seems to be addressing a lot of conditions, including conditions that we would never expect, like blistered legs, for example, is totally unexpected. Ultimately, as the 1979 book chapter said, this is going to open our eyes to disease and disease causation and disease therapies that we have very little comprehension of at this point in time.
This is just fascinating, everything that we've been talking about. Thank you so much for talking with me about all of this. I can't thank you enough for joining me today. And thank you everybody for listening to Hibbert Health, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can see new videos as they get uploaded on an ongoing basis. Thank you so much.